Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Educational Advancement's Gifted Support Group meeting. I'm Zaidra Ibanez, Director of Operations at IEA. IEA is a nationwide nonprofit organization dedicated to the intellectual, creative, and personal growth of our nation's gifted and advanced youth. Central to the mission of IEA is a commitment to the development of the whole child through engaging educational experiences that promote optimal challenge, mentorship, exploration of ideas, and recognition of personal potential. IEA seeks to connect like-minded individuals and supports a diverse community that creates a sense of belonging and well-being. Our goal is to ensure that each gifted child's specific needs are met so that they can work towards meeting their full intellectual and personal potential. And you can learn more about us at educationaladvancement.org. Tonight, I'm excited for our presentation, Getting to the Root of 2E Beyond the Usual Suspects, with our guest speaker, Astina Devante. Hi, Astina. Astina is a consultant at Smart Is Not Easy, LLC. She has served as president of the Northwest Gifted Child Association, serves as co-president of the Washington Coalition for Gifted Education, and president of the North Shore HiCap Parents Council. Astina speaks regularly at conferences, conducts parent education and professional development workshops, and works with school districts on the unique social and emotional development of highly capable HiCap or gifted children with a focus on equitable identification strategies. With her experience as a parent and parent coach, along with synthesized research, current district practices across Washington state, and cutting-edge neuroscience, Astina specializes in helping families get to the root cause of their kids' challenge. Astina holds a master's degree from MIT and is a certified SANG model parent group facilitator and is currently a doctoral student at Bridges Graduate School. Welcome, Astina, and thank you.
Thank you, Zaidra, and I'm so glad to be here. Let me get my slides up and we can get this show on the road. So here is our topic for today, getting to the root of 2E, and a topic that is near and dear to my heart, kind of getting past the usual suspects and really trying to look for the deeper root cause of what's going on, which has been a personal passion of mine. So here's our agenda. It's going to be a pretty action-packed hour, and I hope we'll have time for questions afterwards. Please make sure you put those questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I know Zaidra's looking for them, and we'll be sorting through them to help facilitate that part. So we're going to start by talking about what do we actually mean by twice exceptional, about the problems with misdiagnosis and missed diagnosis, why we're going to bother looking for root causes and why it's actually important to look for root causes, just a few words on IEPs and 504s and the difference. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about what I think is one of the most overlooked areas of twice exceptional, which is what I call the input systems. Then we'll take a deep dive on the 5 different root causes of writing troubles and all the different things that can kind of sort of look like ADHD and often get misdiagnosed. We'll finish up with just some general strategies that are good for almost all 2E students, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. All right, so I like using this photo for twice exceptional because it gives us kind of a visceral idea of what we're talking about here. You know, for a twice exceptional student, the vista is magnificent. The potential is unlimited, but boy, it is a twisty, turny road. And sometimes it feels like that road can be going backwards. And I think this is a great sort of place to ground us before we start talking about the nuts and bolts. So what do we mean by twice exceptional? We mean a student who's highly capable, that's what we say in Washington State, or gifted, or a high IQ, those are all reasonable synonyms, and also has some sort of disability, a learning difference, a mental health issue, some other kind of challenge that's going to make it harder for them to perform in a traditional way. I think this is a really great quote from one of the more formal definitions of twice exceptionality from Sally Reese and Susan Baum and gang. It's a unique population of students who may fail to demonstrate either high academic performance or their specific disabilities. Their gifts may mask their disabilities, or their disabilities may mask their gifts. And so these kids often hide under radar. We don't really appreciate exactly how much they're struggling sometimes because they can compensate so much. Another way to think about twice exceptionality is about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is really not just about autism. That was a place where that term started. But these days we're talking about neurodiversity in a much broader way, to recognize that every brain is unique, not just neurodiverse brains, but really every brain is unique like a fingerprint. And when we have a twice exceptional student who is both, high on the IQ bell curve and also has various challenges, that just makes them extra neurodiverse. So we're going to see patterns of strengths and challenges. Sometimes we call that asynchrony. And I think one of the important things to recognize is that these kids are going to be very individual. One 2E kid is not going to necessarily look or act or need the same things as another 2E kid. And so we need to really build an individual plan and respect their individual differences and their individual strengths and challenges. All right, so what else can we say about 2E? I think there's a quite high incidence, and in my own consulting work, it is extremely common for me to talk to a family and help them see that there is perhaps a challenge there that they didn't realize. And, I particularly enjoy doing that with families with younger kids because it's so much easier to address these concerns when kids are young. There's often quite a lot you can do. But these kids are often under-identified because they can compensate. They can mask their disabilities. They may have challenges that are somewhat subtle. They may be situation dependent. If school is not that difficult and is sort of below their cognitive level, they can often compensate pretty effectively, and therefore nobody really realizes how much they're struggling. It's really common for these kids to not have a diagnosis until middle or high school. And unfortunately and frustratingly, school evaluations may not pick it up, even if a kid is referred for a school evaluation. You often need a private evaluation by an expert that really understands the gifted population. And unfortunately, a neuropsych evaluation, even though it looks like it's very full and complete, really only tells you about half of what you want to know. You really need to kind of look at a team-based approach and understand that there may be more than one specialist you need to look at and to get advice from to really see the whole 360-degree picture for a kid. So you may have heard of the Misdiagnosis initiative by the Sang organization. They've picked up on this a long time ago, and they provide some support there. They also reiterate it's really important to find an expert. So we're going to spend our time thinking about root causes because the strategies and the supports and the interventions and even just the way that we think about how we're going to help a kid are going to be different depending on the cause. And while some of the symptoms can really overlap, and if we're sort of look at this constellation of symptoms and think that it's that cause, but actually it's this one, we might be really causing trouble, because if we apply a support that doesn't work, it's going to cause frustration. And now everybody, both the kid and the teacher and the school and the parents, are all kind of going, but wait, this was supposed to work and it didn't. So it's really important for us to get to the root cause and to the right root cause. Accurate diagnosis is really important. And of course, once we have that, that makes it possible to get an IEP or a 504 plan in place. So we're going to use this metaphor of a tree later on, where the leaves of the tree are going to have our symptoms, but the causes are going to be at the root level. And they're kind of under the level of the soil, maybe not immediately visible, but actually what is driving what's going on. So let's talk for just a second about IEPs versus 504 plans. So the big difference is really the first line there. An IEP, or an individual education plan, is when a student needs different instruction. When there's something about what we're actually teaching and what the curriculum is that we are going to need to change in a substantial way. Whereas a 504 plan is really not about changing the instruction. It's about changing how that instruction is given. Maybe it's given in a different format. Maybe the student is allowed to work in a different medium. Maybe they're allowed to type instead of handwrite. But those are accommodations that don't actually change the curriculum. An IEP is pretty challenging to get for any gifted student or twice exceptional student, because typically a student needs to be performing quite a bit below grade level. I'd say sort of with the typical rule that I see is about 2 grade levels below standard to qualify. And so in reading or math, that is pretty tough and doesn't often happen with our students. It does sometimes happen, however, for social emotional support, for behavioral support, if a student needs some speech. And so if a gifted student has an IEP, it's usually for one of those things. If you want to seek an IEP, you're going to ask for a full evaluation in writing, or you're going to bring some results from an outside specialist. And obviously, IEPs are only available in public schools. They're provided through federal funding. On the other side, for a Section 504, this is much more common in our population, and it's much more accessible. So the way that process gets started, it's really based on a diagnosis. And so what you need is a doctor's note. And it actually could be any doctor, even your pediatrician. Even your pediatrician could write a note and say, I think this kid's got ADHD. I would suggest you get a 504 plan in place with some accommodations. And that is actually sufficient evidence to get that process started. The way that you move forward is you contact your teacher and your school principal. They'll schedule a meeting. And for, I would say one hot tip is that if you have an elementary age student and you are lucky to be in a school where their needs are being met because they have really fantastic teachers, you may get the advice, you don't really need a 504 plan. Well, actually you do, even if the teacher is going to do the right thing, and even next year's teacher is going to do the right thing, because it's really important to have that paper trail when you really need some of those accommodations in middle school or high school. And for that to not be sort of a new thing in secondary school becomes a lot harder to make that argument, and you're always going to kind of get the stink eye. And so best to establish it early on before you really, really need it. And again, only available in public schools. Some private schools will do something like an IEP or a 504 plan, but it's really at their discretion and they are not required to do so. Okay, so let's talk about some overlooked root causes. I think the very most overlooked root causes are what I call the input systems, the sensory systems. We could talk about a lot of different senses, but the two biggies and the ones we're going to spend time on today are vision and auditory. They are foundational to absolutely everything. If the vision system is not working, accurately, then that's going to impact so much of a kid's experience. The same thing with auditory, and we're going to talk about this in more detail in a second. So again, we're seeing all these symptoms, but if the root cause is actually vision or auditory, it's going to be, addressing it at that foundational layer is going to be so much more effective than sort of playing whack-a-mole with the symptoms. All right, so let's talk about these. So vision processing, what would it look like if a kid had vision processing disorders? Number one, it's super common. Not just in the gifted population, but even in the neurotypical population. So common that I have now taken to encouraging families that come consult with me to just screen every kid, because I continue to be surprised at which kids end up being positive. And it ends up being a big deal. And so this is one of those things that is actually quite responsive to therapy and quite, quote unquote, fixable. One of the very few things that really you can, apply enough therapy and you can pretty much almost make it go away. And so it's worth making sure that you know that this is not an issue. What is going on here with vision processing issues is it's not about the eyes, and it's not really about whether the kid needs glasses. It's about how well the brain is controlling the eyes and how well the brain is processing what the eyes are seeing. So it's about the two eyes working together. So for instance, focusing far and near to the blackboard, to my paper, to the blackboard, to the paper as I'm copying something from a whiteboard, perhaps. That changing focal distance and having both eyes focus in the same place at the same time can be part of the issue, and that it could just take a little longer for that focusing to happen. Whether the two eyes are actually moving together as they're moving across the page as a kid is reading. So if your eyes are moving and one eye is bobbling behind, what's going to happen is things are going to go in and out of focus just momentarily. Or things might actually even flip or move on the page. Things that we, perhaps when I was a kid, we used to think of as dyslexia, probably better understood as vision processing disorders. I think that research is still being teased apart, but that's my read of it. And when the two eyes are not working well together, you lose 3D vision. And what can often happen if it's not caught is a kid will actually be looking only out of one eye. The brain will say, I'm getting sort of conflicting input from both eyeballs, so I'm just going to stop paying attention to one of them. And that actually can happen in childhood, and it sticks for adults. And so sometimes you have a kid with vision processing issues, and then you realize you actually have a parent with vision processing issues also. What can also happen is the two eyes can actually bounce back and forth. And so the kid's looking out of their left eye, they're looking out of their right eye, et cetera, back and forth. So like I said, letters and words could flip or move or get blurry. If any kid is mentioning anything like that, that's a big clue for vision issues. They might make goofy mistakes in math. So it says plus, but they actually did minus because they didn't clearly see the difference. They might be a little clumsy. They might have trouble with athletics, especially ball sports. They probably don't like 3D movies because keeping and sustaining that 3D vision with both eyes might be troublesome with stamina. They're going to have trouble with stamina when reading, especially when fonts get smaller. So you can have a really strong, fluent reader who really resists moving to chapter books. Or you might have a kid who really just doesn't like reading. They can read, but they don't like reading. And sometimes it even gets misdiagnosed as ADHD. It's not really an attention issue. It's actually just a vision stamina issue. Often I see this showing up as inconsistent scores on standardized tests. Why? Because when we put kids on standardized tests, that's often the first time that we ask them to do something that requires near vision and really great attention to detail and stamina for a long period of time for a first or a second grader. We just don't do that to first or second graders in typical schools. They're here, they're there, they're moving around the classroom. And so that very first time that they sit in front of the COGAT might be the very first time that their vision system has been strained to that degree, where detail matters right to the very last second. So if you're thinking that this might be a deal for you, I would encourage you to go to covd.org. They've got great listings there. And in particular, look for the FCOVD credential. That is a pretty decent proxy for higher quality and higher training. But recognize that there is quite a lot of variety in how people approach vision processing. And so getting local feedback and local advice is a really good idea to make sure that you find somebody who's really excellent. All right, so let's talk about the auditory analog. So for auditory processing disorders, this is now about hearing. And if you take them to a regular audiologist or a regular school hearing test or a pediatrician hearing test, what you'll get is this kid's hearing is fabulous. And it might even be super sensitive. Wow, this kid can hear way more than we would even expect. What's the problem is sometimes, often, not always, excuse me, but often in our population, is that it's a timing issue where one ear is actually hearing a little bit before the other. Sound is coming in both ears at the same time, but the brain is processing a little longer on one side than on the other. So by the time it meets in the middle, it's often timed by just a little bit. In a quiet environment like this, where there's no background noise, you're only listening to me, brain can usually put it together. But if there's a lot of noise, and a lot of different sound signals coming in, and the timing is off, the brain doesn't know what goes with what. It doesn't connect. And so the kid is hearing everything, but they may not be making sense of it. They're not necessarily hearing the words, they're hearing noise. Does that make sense? Okay, so what that can result in when we've got little guys, they're probably doing a lot of this. They're probably startling at loud noises. They might develop a habit of wearing hats or hoods or long hair or headphones, things that cover or distort sound going into the ears. They're probably not going to like noisy environments. They're probably not going to like background noise. They're going to have trouble remembering multi-step directions. If you ask them, hey, is that conversation across the room louder, quieter, or the same as the conversation I'm having with you? They might say it's the same, or it might even be louder. Why? Because these sound signals aren't connecting and they can't tell what is the most primary. So everything is coming in sort of as loud, and the brain is not sort of naturally dampening things. There's this rising anxiety or fatigue or frustration throughout the day. They're usually more able to cope in the morning than in the afternoon. So this can easily look like ADHD, like oppositional defiant, pathological demand avoidance, explosive behavior, really super, super common. And so if this is sounding interesting to you, I'd encourage you to look at one of these two places. Able Kids Foundation in Colorado makes a gizmo called an ear filter that is pretty magical for a lot of kids in our population. Dr. Ray Stout goes at it a different way. She makes something called low gain hearing aids that are also helpful for some students. I would say the ear filter is probably the most popular. And so particularly if you've got a kid who is really having trouble in the classroom, who's having explosive behavior, who's having meltdowns, really, I'd strongly encourage you to look into auditory processing issues. It's usually the missing link that people don't think of. Okay, so let's talk about writing troubles. Writing is, I'd say, of all the things that sort of plagues twice exceptional students, it's one that comes up very often for so many. And so there are 5 different causes that I have kind of separated both through my work with families as well as through reading and research as being sort of separate and separate enough where you would do something different depending on what's going on. So here are the 5 causes that I can talk about. First, let's talk about what the symptoms look like, right? So kids where it's hard to get ideas out, or they're just not producing very much, or they're having trouble with grammar and punctuation and capitalization, or it's about letter formation, or it's about messy handwriting, or they're just avoiding handwriting, or this is really interesting. You've got the kid who actually writes very neatly, but it's exquisitely slow. Their hand hurts, so they're doing a lot of this. They're drawing letters one stroke at a time. That's often where that slow but very neat handwriting is coming from. They have trouble organizing their ideas. They have a lousy pencil grip. They're writing with run-on sentences. They're making errors even when they're copying something. So all of those are different sort of symptoms. What are the different possible causes? So one possible cause is sort of a fine motor or muscular issue. Another cause is a brain automaticity issue about the automaticity of writing and forming letters. The third one we've already talked about is vision processing. We'll talk about specifically how that impacts writing. Fourth, very important, is stealth dyslexia can actually cause writing issues. And in fact, in our population, stealth dyslexia is going to be most visible in a student's writing, not their reading. And the last one is ADHD or executive function type issues. So we're going to look at each of these one at a time. So here are the things that we might see with a kid who has fine motor issues. But what you'll notice is that when I just sort of do it from this perspective, it's hard to figure out what the root cause is. Let's dial in a little deeper. So what's the root cause of the fine motor issues? Well, it's all those little small muscles in the hands, but it's also the big muscles. the big muscles in the arm, and actually the really big muscles in sort of the core and the trunk, because it's also about being able to sit and hold your body while you're writing and having the stamina for that. And of course, there's some coordination involved. So what would you see if this was going on? You'd have a kid who says, my hand hurts, and who's shaking out their hand, and who's making all sorts of hand stuff when you give them a pencil. They probably have a funky pencil grip. They might be kind of wriggling in their seat. They might be kind of lying or moving as they're writing. And this is probably one of the biggest clues, is that this kid will also dislike drawing, and they'll also dislike doing crafts or things that require sort of small, fine motor movement. And so that's a big clue that it's a muscular issue or a fine motor issue, as opposed to something else where the kid might actually be fabulous at drawing, but still have trouble with writing. All right, so how can we help if it's a fine motor issue? The gold standard is occupational therapy. That's available both in schools as well as privately. The kid really has to have significant issues for the school to be willing to do occupational therapy. And so don't be shocked if they tell you that your kid doesn't qualify. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be helpful. You might consider doing that outside of school, and usually insurance will pay for it. Things that you could do on your own that are also things that probably your occupational therapist will tell you to do is to draw with tiny crayons or tiny chalk. It forces the pencil, the tripod grip. And so that is a great way for a kid to practice and sort of work on those muscles. Similarly, working with Play-Doh, working with clay. There are all kinds of pencil grip devices that you can try out and play around with that will sort of force the right grip and help support a student to make sure that their fingers are in the right place until that starts feeling natural. Also, a fun way to do it is to have them play with perler beads. This is especially helpful for young students. These are these teeny tiny little round plastic beads that you can put on a grid. You can be quite creative with them. You can follow a pattern, but you can also make your own thing. And it requires a lot of that fine motor control. And so it's a great way to practice, especially if you have young kids. But the bottom line here is that when it's a physical issue, if the physical stuff hasn't resolved by middle elementary, it is so hard to make it improve all that much after then. It requires really a ton of repetition. And so if this is a long-standing issue, you may really want to think about this is not something that's going to change dramatically, and moving towards keyboarding or dictation to kind of get the to allow the kid to do writing without having to involve all this muscular stuff. All right, so let's talk about number 2, automaticity. So again, in the leaves of the tree, it's sort of this, eclectic mix of things that doesn't necessarily make it clear what's going on here. So let's dig in. What's the root cause? The root cause is a brain-based issue of letter formation, right? So somewhere around kindergarten, first, second grade, when a kid is making their letters, they should stop having to think about, I have to go around and down to make a letter A. They should be able to close their eyes and think letter A, and their hand just does it, right? Well, when that automaticity part of the brain is not doing its job, that never really happens. And at some level, the kid is always thinking about all those strokes. And so therefore, they have much less brain power left over to do all the big thinking that is involved in writing. And so you might think of this as muscle memory, or some people call it motor memory for letters and numbers. It really should be automatic by second grade, at the very least by third grade. And so if it is not, that's going to be your issue. So how would you spot this? You would notice this because the kid is using unusual strokes for their letters, and they might actually change. Like sometimes they start at the top of the B, and sometimes they start at the bottom of the B. And it might be different on the same page, and letters that they write even on the same page may look different from each other. This is the case where a kid might have very messy, illegible handwriting, Or they may really know what they're going for and be a little perfectionistic perhaps and can create very neat, precise writing, but it is exquisitely slow. And they are effectively drawing each letter. Often these are artistic kids who are really fabulous at art. And so you really don't think that it's sort of a brain-based issue because it seems like they really can produce and they really can produce with a pencil. But the problem is the automaticity of letter formation that really needs to be automatic for writing to be fluid. Okay, so if automaticity is your issue, how do you help? I'd say this is a place where nobody really knows for sure, but there are two things that I have identified over the years that people say seem to really make a difference. So one is called this lazy 8 exercise that you can see a picture of on the left. There's a video on YouTube. If you search for lazy 8 exercise, you'll find it quite easily. And you'll recognize it because you've seen this picture now. And so what that picture is demonstrating is you have the kid take their non-dominant hand, hold it at the middle of the paper, take their dominant hand holding a pencil or a pen or whatever, or a crayon, whatever it is they're going to write with, and they're going to make a figure 8 sign, a lazy 8 on the page. And they're going to keep doing that until it feels like they can do it with their eyes closed. And now what's that doing? It's turning on that automaticity part of the brain. And then you're going to stop and they're going to make one letter. And this video will show you exactly where to put the letter on that butterfly. And so let's say it's a letter A, a big around and down for a letter A. And then you're going to do the lazy 8 again. What's that doing? The theory is that what fires together wires together from a neuroscience perspective. So we're turning on the automaticity part of the brain and we're connecting that to a letter. And then we're turning on the automaticity part of the brain and we're connecting it to a letter. There are folks who really claim that it works amazingly well. It does require a lot of repetition. It requires much less repetition with young kids than with older kids. There's also a program called the Aerosmith program that does a lot of different things, that neuroscience-based ways of working with learning disabilities. And their word and tracing exercises are also based on automaticity. But the bottom line is whichever approach you use, it requires a lot of repetition. And so if this is a persistent problem, after about middle elementary, you should really think hard about whether it's worth continuing to work on this. And it might be more effective to switch to keyboarding or dictation to get this out of the way. Okay, so vision processing. Here are the things that you might notice with vision processing. How could vision processing have anything to do with writing? Well, actually, if you can't see accurately, consistently, every time the same, what you're writing, that's going to make it difficult to write accurately. So as we mentioned before, it's a brain-based issue. It's about the eyes working together. It's about the two eyes being able to focus and refocus and see 3D, et cetera. And so how would that show up in writing? You're going to see this where the kid is having trouble copying things. When they can't copy well, you're going to start thinking, gosh, I wonder if they're actually seeing it to begin with. You're also going to notice that when there's vision processing issues and the kid might be dealing with, say, letters that are flipping on them, one of the ways that they compensate for that is by making those letters capital. A capital D or a capital B doesn't have this flipping problem. And so when a kid is writing capital letters, especially in the middle of words or inappropriately in the middle of sentences, that is a big clue that they are trying to do the best that they can to compensate for a vision processing issue that is not fully stable. Also, punctuation is very small, and so they might not see it as readily or notice it as much, and so they may have trouble, particularly with punctuation. You'll also notice that they're going to probably make silly mistakes in math, usually because they're missing the plus or the minus, or, as they get older, the multiply and divide. And that those little symbols, they might glance at them and actually not quite see them accurately or miss certain pieces of them. Okay, so how do we help vision processing issues? As I mentioned before, there is something called vision therapy. If you happen to be in the Seattle area, I really like Alderwood Vision Therapy, but there are lots and lots of places across the country that are on that website. And again, you look for the FCOVD credential. But we can also help kids who we suspect having vision processing issues just by making things bigger. Right. And so if we can get them large fonts on an e-reader, on a Kindle of some sort, and bump up the font size, that's going to be a really helpful support for them. Or photocopying things onto much bigger paper. You can photocopy an 8.5 by 11 anything onto 11 by 17, and that makes it quite a bit bigger. And so that can be a really helpful short-term support. Allowing them to sit up front. Providing a slant board. The angle of a slant board makes it as efficient as possible for the eyes to see what's going on there. And some people claim that reading strips can be really helpful for reading. Some people believe that the colors make a difference. The jury's still out on that one for me. But you're welcome to try different colors and see if it makes a difference. It might just make your kid more happy. That's possible too. I think the real benefit in those reading guide strips is that the darker lines at the top and the bottom black out some text so that you're focusing just on the text in the center. And so it helps your eye track across the text and not get confused and move around. All right. And to the extent that the dyslexia font helps for anybody, it probably helps most if you have vision processing issues, not really dyslexia. Because again, it's about the dyslexia font was designed to help make it like letters that flip be more independent and different from each other so that if they flip, it's obvious that it's not correct. All right, so let us talk about dyslexia because dyslexia is not the same as vision issues. It is totally different. However, there is a lot of overlap in the leaves of the tree. So what is the root cause of stealth dyslexia? In our population, when kids are dyslexic but are quite bright, what usually happens is that they learn how to read, sometimes without incident, sometimes a little bit late, and occasionally even early. But what they're doing by reading is that they skipped the sounding out phase, and they're reading everything as sight words. You might have tried to sound out words with them when they were young, and it just didn't stick. They moved to sight words. And once they were working with everything as sight words, then their reading really took off. And they're quite fluent, and they have lots and lots of sight words. They have memorized thousands and thousands of sight words. Where they have challenges is what's called phonological awareness. What is phonological awareness? It's the awareness of the sounds of language and how they are separate from each other. I'm going to do a classic phonological awareness exercise with you. I would like you to repeat after me. Say this word. The word is bloom, like a flower. Say the word bloom. Okay, so what is the word bloom without the ul sound? If you said boom, you're correct. Now, some of you might have struggled with that a little bit, and you might start wondering, gosh, do I perhaps have a little dyslexia in my history? And that's possible. And if that's true, think even harder about your kids because there seems to be a pretty strong genetic link. But that kind of phonological awareness of being able to take apart and put back together the sounds of language orally, not looking at words, not looking at letters, not looking at anything on the page, but just orally, appears to be the root issue with dyslexia. So we've got these kids, these high IQ kids who can compensate for their dyslexia. How do they compensate? By sight words, and they're reading everything as sight words. Well, that works really well in elementary school when text is pretty predictable and pretty guessable, and somewhat repetitive. And so usually their comprehension is really terrific right up until middle school and high school. And at that point, it gets a little tricky because it's harder for them to sound out new words that they've never seen before. Let's think about names of explorers or things that show up in chemistry or biology or physics that they've never run into before. That's when they're going to start having trouble that looks a little bit more like a classic dyslexic trouble, because they're having trouble sounding out new words. But the biggest thing that we're going to see in our population is that they are going to have tremendous trouble with spelling. Why? Because what's called orthographic rules, the rules of spelling, have a real tough time sticking, and they don't have a real good sense as to how to take this whole word and break it apart into the sounds, because their phonological awareness is a real problem area. And that's a real key part. If I've got this word in my head, bloom, and I need to parse it out into those little individual sounds, and then I need to spell each of those sounds, well, it's going to be really hard for me to spell if I can't decompose a word into its component sounds. But as I said, usually excellent comprehension with elementary text. Comprehension issues won't usually show up until later. All right, so what would you see? The biggest thing you're going to see is spelling issues. Perhaps the kid can really study hard for a spelling test at the end of the week. But if you look at those words, even a week or two later, chances are they're fading away. When they are young and even into their older years, they're going to have trouble with rhyming. They might memorize some rhymes, but if you ask them to rhyme, say, a nonsense word, they're going to have a lot of trouble doing that. And all kinds of other wordplay like Pig Latin uses all those same kind of phonological awareness sound skills. They're going to have trouble sounding out words that they've never seen before. Try some nonsense words, try some big complex Latin words. As they're reading, they're likely to skip or substitute words. And so if that's happening, that's a good sign that they're probably not actually reading every word on the page. They're reading enough of it and they're getting the gist. And again, when a kid is stealth dyslexic, you can often see very inconsistent scores on standardized tests. Why? Because on standardized tests, you have these short texts. And so with short texts, there's no repetition. There's no, if you miss one word or you skip one word or you substitute one word or you miss the word not, you're answering a totally different question. And so that's when you end up with comprehension issues, when you have these really short texts. Where else do short texts happen, by the way? Math word problems. That's another place where you're going to see a real up and down profile. The kid sometimes does it great, and sometimes they're answering the wrong question. Why? Because they might not have actually read all the words in the math problem correctly. Okay, so if this is ringing any bells for you, a really great thing to do at home is to go do a quick screening test. There is a free screener that specifically focuses on phonological awareness, which is often the biggest issue, especially in our population. It's called the PAST test, and it's a lot of exercises just like the one that we did together today. You can also play around with those same kind of exercises with nonsense words or trying rhyming harder words, multisyllabic words, or not the usual ones. Cat, sat, bat, fat is not really a good test because most kids just have memorized those. All right, so how do we help when a kid has stealth dyslexia? The gold standard is to get that kid into some tutoring. In Washington State, we've got a Washington dyslexia organization that has some great listings, but in just about every state, there is a similar organization. They will use curriculums like Orton Gillingham or Barton or Wired for Reading or Linda Mood Bell. And all of those are fabulous for getting at that root issue of dyslexia, which is around phonological awareness and sort of manipulating the sounds and of language, and then understanding how that actually maps onto words and text. Even if the issue is only spelling, you actually still start right back at the beginning. The kid will probably progress a lot faster than a kid who's having trouble with reading. But the steps are actually the same steps, and you do have to go back to the beginning. In a public school system, they're likely to call it structured literacy, but it's about the same fundamental tools, and you might see curriculums like Wilson or Hegarty or Sunday. And those are all offering a lot of the same things. Unfortunately, a lot of public schools are not that sophisticated yet with dyslexia. We're starting to see a movement really across the country to get more savvy there. And so if you're in a great place, perhaps your school is really getting there faster, but in a lot of places, it's not happening in the public schools quite yet, and you might need to go outside of school to get high quality support. There are some online programs that are pretty good, but I consider them reinforcement, not primary intervention. Treasure Hunt is a nice one made by Prenda, and also Nessie. If you use that link, this specific link right here, it is available for free. I found it once. I do not know how I found it. I cannot figure out how I got to it, but that link works for a free version. So I would write that one down. treasurehunt.prenda.co. And then also audiobooks, providing ways for kids to read without getting stuck on the sounding out issues, especially as they start getting into more sophisticated stuff, secondary level stuff. And so that's a way to make sure that the kid is getting access to higher level books, even if all of their reading skills are not quite there yet. But probably the biggest message with stealth dyslexia is that if you think this is going on for your kid, do not wait. Intervention in first or second grade is twice as effective as intervention in third grade. I believe that intervention, the sooner the better, is going to be easier and faster and less stress on the kid. And so this is not a wait and see situation. Dyslexia intervention is also known as really solid reading instruction. And so even if you're not quite sure, you just have a family history, you're not going to hurt anybody with it. And you really, really don't want to wait if you have any inkling that this is what's going on with a younger kid. All right, the last one I want to mention that can cause writing issues is ADHD and executive function. So what is the root cause here? Well, let's think about ADHD. ADHD actually is not really a lack of attention. What it really is it's a trouble regulating attention. And so for those of you who have some personal experience, this is probably going to resonate a lot. You can focus, but only when it's certain things, when it's novel, when it's interesting, when it's challenging, or when it's urgent. Those things you can focus on. However, if it's rote or boring or easy, even if it is extremely important, it is really hard for the ADHD brain to focus. It's a brain wiring thing. It's not a willpower thing. It's really about the wiring and the neurodiversity of that type of brain. And then in our population, when you've got a stripe of perfectionism, that can make it even harder. So what might you see that would help you realize that this is actually more of an executive function issue or an ADHD issue as opposed to something else? So this is a kid that has trouble getting started, that has trouble staying on task, especially if it's a non-preferred task. They're going to have trouble with time management, most likely. They're going to have trouble breaking down big projects. They might get overwhelmed by big projects and not sort of figuring out how to break those things down. But here's the key. They can produce when they're interested in the topic. When they have some personal interest or personal investment in a particular topic, all of a sudden they can produce things that they could not produce in other cases. And so that gives you the hint that no, it's probably not a writing issue or a physical issue or an automaticity issue or a dyslexia issue or a vision issue. It's probably more likely an ADHD or executive function type issue. Okay, so if this is what's going on, how do we help? It's pretty obvious when you think about it. We want to figure out how to make it novel or interesting or challenging or urgent. And so can we do something unusual that's going to spark excitement in this topic to make it more interesting? Can we align whatever we're doing with their interests? Can we give choice and topics and formats, again, to align with interests? One way to do that is to really focus on projects for real audiences, what's called authentic projects, right? Because that makes it much more interesting and much more sort of real when there's a real audience who's going to be looking at your work. For a lot of our kids, actually, when it's too easy, that's what makes it hard. So making it more complex or more challenging makes it easier for the ADHD brain to engage. And you can create time pressure, and sometimes that's productive, maybe a little contest or something. But be careful that you don't overuse it because, hair on fire is an occasional strategy. It should not be the always strategy. And so that one should be used with a lot of care. Okay, but there's another thing that happens for our ADHD kiddos, and I'm not totally sure, is it the same as ADHD or is it just closely related or is there a lot of overlap? I'm not sure on that one yet. But what I've noticed is this: when you've got a kid who's got a lot of interesting ideas and you tell them it's time to go write an essay, right? They have a lot of trouble figuring out where to start because in their brain, they've got 1,000 ideas and they're all connected and it's not clear which place to start and where do I start pulling? Because when I'm writing one word at a time in a row, and you only get one word at a time. And so figuring out how to go from this messy network of interrelated ideas to linear writing is actually a pretty tricky transition. It's tricky for a lot of kids, but it can be really downright overwhelming for some of our kids. Okay, so if that's what's going on, how would you help? This is the strategy that I have seen work. You help the kid find a way to get the ideas out of their brain in a messy, disorganized way. And then you organize those ideas where you can see them with your eyes. Okay, so what might this look like? We're going to use sticky notes. So the kid will write down each idea on their sticky notes, and they're going to make a big pile of sticky notes in front of them. And again, we're going to organize them later, but let's just get your ideas out. We're going to draw a mind map. We're going to draw other pictures. Maybe we'll dictate. And so the kid will dictate and we'll have a conversation, and maybe their friendly adult helper is going to be typing everything that they say, right? And when they're done, they hand the typewritten thing back to the kid and say, okay, now organize this into an outline. This was a great technique that was taught to me by the lovely Kristen Eller, and she did such a fantastic job with that technique, and I think it really is a fantastic technique that can be used by many others. Have somebody scribe what's going on for the kid. Or have the kid pair up with somebody else and walk and talk, right? So, talk through your ideas. Well, I'm thinking about doing this. And the other kid, talks about, well, I'm thinking about doing that. And as they talk about it, it helps them organize their ideas. The walk and talk approach, I'd say, is kind of a halfway approach because it doesn't get anything down on paper where you can see it. But sometimes for some kids, that's enough to just sort of process it through as they're walking and talking. And at that point, they sometimes are then ready to sit down and write. But the bottom line is we need to find a way for each student to figure out what works for them. And it's probably going to be different for different kids. But the thing that will not work is the standard graphic organizer that you can find a gazillion of on the internet. They usually have a box that say, put your main idea here and put your ideas for paragraph 1 here and your ideas for paragraph 2 here. That doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because it imposes order too soon. The kid doesn't know what belongs in which box yet, right? They need to get it all out first, and then they can start putting it into different categories. Here's an example of what this could look like. So imagine a kid makes a mind map in this case and a couple of sort of drawings of different ideas that they have on a particular topic, right? And now once it's drawn, now you take a big red marker and you say, okay, well, that looks like it could maybe be a paragraph. And those look like they could kind of be paragraphs. Okay, and maybe we even start numbering them. Here's paragraph 1, here's paragraph 2, here's paragraph 3. And now that you've got this picture in front of you, hang that up next to your computer or your paper, and now you start trying to put some sentences together. You've got a little bit more structure. Okay, so let's talk about ADHD. There are actually a lot of things that can look like ADHD. I call them the lookalikes. This is the list from Jim Webb's book. And it includes a lot of things. Depression can look like ADHD. So can anxiety. So can any of the learning disabilities. Difficulties in an environment or a mismatch in expectations. Auditory processing things that we talked about earlier, as well as a couple of physical things. I have also seen all of these things in the blue box be misdiagnosed as ADHD. And so that can be vision processing and auditory processing issues that we saw earlier, sensory processing issues. I'd say the one that's worth a particular call out is sleep apnea. If a kid is not sleeping well or effectively, it is going to look exactly like ADHD. And unfortunately, a kid can have sleep apnea and not snore or grunt or wake or have any visible anything that would tip you off to it. It can really, truly be silent. The only way to know for sure is to go to a sleep specialist and do a sleep study. Often that happens with parents sleeping with kid in the room, by the way. And so it's a lot more doable than it sounds. There are also a whole lot of physical things that can be happening that can make the body react very much like ADHD. Those are worth just a moment here to talk about medical issues. There's something that I think is more common in our population than we realize called PANDAS or PANS. This is an autoimmune disease that's triggered either by strep or by some related infections that can cause anxiety, intrusive thoughts, OCD, restricted eating, irritability, and it can often have sort of an up and down episodic course. Do not believe what you read on the internet. Actually, if you've ever looked into this, you'll notice that a lot of people say it has to be acute onset. It's turning out that that's not actually true. Stanford University has done a bunch of research on this, and they're one of the best clinics in the country. And what they have found is only 40% of their cases are actually acute onset. The dominant case is what's called insidious or gradual onset. Asthma and autoimmune disease is actually quite common in our population, more common than in the neurotypical population, and can have system-wide impacts. Same with food allergies and sensitivities, chemical or mold sensitivities, heavy metal toxicity, and even things like adrenal fatigue and hypothyroid and nutritional issues. Any of these can actually upset the system from a fundamental level. Remember, we're looking at the root cause and cause all sorts of other things to get out of whack that we might diagnose, say, as an ADHD or something else. But really, the root issue is actually medical in nature. And so please keep that in mind. And especially if you're dealing with issues that feel very pervasive and you're kind of playing whack-a-mole with a lot of different symptoms, start thinking, wait, maybe there's actually a medical cause underneath all of this. Okay, so in closing, just a couple general strategies for 2E. Adults do not have to be Swiss Army knives. You do not have to be great at everything as an adult, right? As an adult, we focus our careers on our strengths. Here's a very powerful idea from Tom Armstrong about niche environments. We create niche environments around ourselves as adults that support what we need supported or that just avoid or eliminate our weaknesses. And that's what our kids are going to do also. Their challenge areas are probably not going to be their focus for their careers. And so let it go. It may not be as important as it may feel initially. We think that we want our kids to be well-rounded. But actually, a lot of our kids end up being spiky. They have sort of a core of basic skills. And yes, we do need to help them get those basic skills. And that does include a certain amount of reading and writing, right? But where they're really going to excel is going to be in some other area. It might be math. It might be art. It might be anything, right? And here's the thing, guys. These days, colleges are looking for spiky applicants. that's actually who has the upper hand these days if you're thinking about college applications. And I think that's not just colleges, that's also kind of the world, right? The world really appreciates people who have sort of that deep passion and deep interest in an area. And the fact that they don't necessarily have the world's best skills in other areas really doesn't matter as much. So best practices for this population, we want to make sure that we're giving challenge. Even if a kid is struggling in an area, we want to make sure that we're finding the places where they're ready for acceleration, where they're ready for depth and complexity and problem solving, and that we're supporting it. And we're doing it in a way that minimizes their challenges as much as possible. We want to individualize for their individual needs because every kid is going to have different needs and strengths and interests. We want to provide accommodations as universally as possible. That's an idea called UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, right? So if a kid is allowed to use a keyboard to type, then every kid in the classroom should be allowed to use a keyboard to type. Because the reality is that most of our twice exceptional kids are never going to be diagnosed, but they still need those accommodations, even if they don't have a parent who is listening to this talk and is going to go get a 504 plan for them. If you're a teacher, we want to be grading by learning objectives, not by executive function. It's not about whether the kid can hand it in on time. It's about whether the kid actually knows the content. In secondary school, that tends to get pretty fuzzy in a lot of places. And we want to have a lot of flexibility to have that kid be able to show mastery in lots of different ways. In general, we want these kids to develop a spiky strength, and we want to help foster that, help them discover what their strength is, and help make sure that they've really got time and energy and effort to spend on that spiky strength, and not over-index and spend too much time on their deficits and their weaknesses. When we ask them to write, we want to ask a very important question first. Do they actually have to write? As Susan Baum says, don't turn everything into a secret language arts lesson. If the actual task is history or science, they might not need to write. Think about what is the actual learning objective here. Those of you who are homeschooling are probably also thinking about this. So there's lots of different ways that a kid can demonstrate mastery. They can draw a diagram, they can make a poster, they can make slides, a comic strip, make a podcast, make a video, build a model. The bottom line is give kids choices of different ways that they can demonstrate mastery, because the point here is communication of ideas. And there's lots of ways to do that that does not involve a 5-paragraph essay. And there's also lots of assistive technology that can help. I think probably the one that people maybe have not heard of is called SnapType. It's available on iPad or iPhone, and it lets you take a photo of any worksheet or really any piece of paper and then type into it. And so if a kid really needs to type everything, that makes it very possible for them to type anything. Obviously, keyboarding and dictation and scribing is all really helpful for kids who need support with writing. Why? Because we want to make sure that they're not getting stuck in the mechanics and that we're allowing them to get into that higher order thinking, right? That's why that's important. And for some kids, that's going to be what they're going to do forever. And in our modern life, like how often do you actually write longhand with a pencil anymore? Keyboarding is a life skill. And then spell check and grammar tools, especially for our dyslexic kids, are going to be super, super important. So I will stop there. I am happy to take questions. I know that was kind of a roller coaster ride, but I hope it was helpful. And I will sit back and see what you guys have to say.
Thank you so much for that. That was such great information.